You reach for the shaker on the kitchen counter. It's a mundane Saturday morning, and the scent of your breakfast is missing that final woody warmth. You tap the jar, and a fine, copper-coloured dust settles onto your oatmeal or your latte. It is cheap. It is everywhere. It is so common that you likely haven't given it a second thought in years. But as that sweet, sharp aroma hits your senses, you're inhaling the ghost of a world that no longer exists. You're smelling a substance that once fueled the rise and fall of empires. You're smelling the catalyst for the age of discovery. If you had held this jar in your hand 500 years ago, you wouldn't be standing in a kitchen. You would be standing in a vault. You would be holding a king's ransom, a treasure more stable than gold and more sought after than silk. This powder was once the singular obsession of the known world, a mystery wrapped in a myth, protected by blood and salt water. Let us step away from the convenience of the modern supermarket. Close your eyes and feel the floor beneath you dissolve into the shifting sands of the Silk Road. The plastic jar in your hand transforms into a heavy, woven burlap sack, cinched tight with hemp rope. The air around you grows hot and dry, thick with the smell of camel musk and wood smoke. Welcome to the year 1400. You are a merchant in the markets of Alexandria. You watch the caravans arrive from the east, exhausted and sun-bleached. You ask the traders where this cinnamon comes from, and they tell you tales that chill your blood. They speak of giant winged birds, the cinnamologus, that build nests of cinnamon sticks on the sides of sheer, unclimbable cliffs. They tell you of brave men who leave giant chunks of donkey meat at the base of the cliffs to lure the birds down. When the birds carry the heavy meat back to their nests, the structures collapse under the weight, sending the precious bark tumbling to the canyon floor for the merchants to gather. They tell you of deep, dark lakes guarded by ferocious winged serpents. To get the spice, you must wear suits of lead and brave the fangs of monsters. You listen, wide-eyed, and you pay the exorbitant price. But what you don't know, what no one in Europe or the Middle East knows yet, is that these stories are a lie. They are the first great marketing campaign in human history. The Arab merchants who control the trade routes have invented these monsters to keep you from looking for the source. They want you to believe the spice is supernatural so you never realize it grows on a quiet emerald island at the edge of the world. To find the truth, we must travel further back and further east. We leave the desert and fly over the crashing waves of the Indian Ocean, landing on the shores of Serendib, the island you know as Sri Lanka. Here, the air is heavy with moisture and the songs of tropical birds. You're no longer a merchant, you're a harvester. You stand before a Cinnamomum verum tree. It looks unremarkable at first with its thick leathery leaves, but then you take a curved knife and slice into the soft inner bark of a young branch. You peel it away in long wet strips. As the sun hits the bark, it begins to curl into the scrolls you recognize. The quills. The scent is overwhelming, bright, citrusy, and deeply spicy. For centuries, the people of this island have known the secret. They have watched the monsoon winds carry ships from across the sea, ships full of men desperate for this bark. In the ancient world, cinnamon wasn't just for flavour, it was for the gods. You see it being carried into the temples of Egypt, where it is used to embalm the bodies of pharaohs, preserving the flesh for eternity. You see it in the holy anointing oils of the Hebrew priests. In Rome, you watch the Emperor Nero burn a year's worth of the city's cinnamon supply at the funeral of his wife, a display of wealth so gaudy it made the Senate tremble. But as the centuries turn, the appetite for the spice grows into a fever. By the late 1400s, the old land routes are choked by the rising power of the Ottoman Empire. The price of your breakfast topping skyrockets. In the courts of Lisbon and Madrid, kings are pacing. They are tired of paying the middlemen. They are tired of the myths of giant birds and winged serpents. They want the source. You are now a sailor on the deck of a Portuguese caravel. The wood beneath your feet groans as it climbs the massive swells of the Atlantic. You are terrified. You have been told that the ocean boils at the equator and that sea monsters wait to swallow ships whole, but the hunger for cinnamon is stronger than the fear of death. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sets sail, hoping to find a back door to the Spicelands. He returns with his cinnamon from the Americas, but it is a fraud, a different bark entirely. The world remains hungry. Then, in 1498, Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape of Good Hope. The door to the east is kicked open. By 1518, the Portuguese have found the island of Sri Lanka. You see them build a fort at Colombo, They don't come as partners, they come as conquerors. They demand a tribute of cinnamon from the local king, hundreds of thousands of pounds of it every year. The peaceful harvest you witnessed earlier is now a labour of blood. The Salagama people, the traditional harvesters, are forced into a system of brutal quotas. If they fail to deliver, the punishment is death. For 100 years, Portugal holds the secret. They become the richest nation in Europe, fueled by the bark of a tree. But secrets in the spice trade are never kept forever. The Dutch are watching. They have formed the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, the first true mega-corporation in history. You see their black-hulled ships bristling with cannons. They don't just want a share of the trade, they want the monopoly. In the mid-1600s, they drive the Portuguese out of Sri Lanka with a violence that shocks the region. Under Dutch rule, the cinnamon trade becomes a machine. They realise that if there is too much cinnamon on the market, the price will drop. So you watch as they burn mountains of precious bark in the streets of Amsterdam, the air smelling of 1 trillion cookies while the poor look on in confusion. They want to keep the world hungry. They want to keep it rare. But the world is changing. You see the British arriving next, their empire expanding like an ink blot across the map. By the end of the 1800s, they have taken the island. But something has happened that the great companies didn't foresee. While the empires fought and bled for the true cinnamon of Sri Lanka, a cousin was waiting in the wings. In the forests of China, Indonesia and Vietnam, a hardier, thicker bark was being harvested. Cassia. It was stronger, cheaper, and easier to grow. You watch as the exclusive aristocratic grip on cinnamon begins to slip. Farmers begin to plant cinnamon trees in other colonies, in the Seychelles, in Madagascar, in South America. The monopoly shatters. The gold of the forest is suddenly being loaded onto steamships by the ton. The price plummets. The spice that once caused naval battles and built fortresses begins to find its way into the kitchens of the common people. It moves from the temple altars and the royal vaults into the spice racks of the growing middle class. It becomes an ingredient for apple pies, for morning buns, for the comfort foods of a globalizing world. Now, come back to your kitchen. Look at that jar again. It feels light in your hand, but it carries the weight of 5,000 years of human ambition. That powder represents the first time the entire planet was stitched together by a single desire. To bring that jar to your table, men had to map the stars. They had to invent new ways of sailing against the wind. They had to build the very foundations of global finance and international law. The history of cinnamon is not a story of a recipe. It is a story of the human spirit, our insatiable curiosity, our darker urge to dominate, and our constant search for something that makes life taste a little less ordinary. The great empires that fought over this bark are gone. The forts in Colombo are ruins covered in moss. The myths of the cynomolgus and the winged serpents have been replaced by botanical charts and shipping manifests, but the spice remains. The next time you open that jar, take a moment. Inhale deeply. You aren't just smelling a spice. You're smelling the dust of the Silk Road. You're smelling the salt of the Indian Ocean. You're smelling the drive that pushed humanity across the horizon to see what lay on the other side. It is perhaps the most powerful thing in your house, and all it took to get there was the courage to change the world.